equally fruitful to all of us, myself included. I also need to add this comment. What you are doing with the Catholic Federation and the CMDS in seeking to do something together, it seems to me tremendously, tremendously significant. And the consequence of that, at least for me personally, is that I'm deeply honored to be part of something that brings these two societies together. I recently had the privilege, must be around 6 weeks ago, just under 6 weeks ago, the Roman Catholic Diocese in Saskatoon invited me to give a public lecture hosted by the cathedral, by the bishop. And the lecture that I gave was entitled, "What Can Evangelicals Learn from Catholics?" I opened, by the way, they're going to have another follow-up where they do "What Can Catholics Learn from Evangelicals?" But I did the first half of that two-part series. And I opened by suggesting, and I would suggest it to you as well, that I think the edge of ecumenism in our day is going to be asking the question, what can we learn from one another? Not just what are our differences and how can we manage them, but what can we learn from one another and what can we learn together? And we need one another in order to learn together. And if that can be part of the fruitfulness of your conference here in Calgary, that would be a very, very good thing. One thing is sure, that God loves the world, and that God's love redeems, reconciles, and restores. Love does make the world go round. But one other thing is also sure, that Christians are called to love the world as a vital means by which they fulfill their religious identity. It is their calling, you might say. It is their vocation to love as God has loved. And as such, our love for the world is a crucial means by which we fulfill, a means by which the grace of God is fulfilled in the world. Our part in the purposes of God in the world is that we would love the world even as God has loved the world. The words of Ephesians 5, verses 1 and 2, provide some of the basis for this vision of love. Therefore, be imitators of God as God's beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. But what precisely does this mean, to imitate God? What does it mean to live in love? And to do so as a means of self-giving, generous service. This is no small question. Indeed, in a very real sense, it is foundational to any Christian sense of vocation or calling. For in essence, the Christian calling is not just to do good work, not even just to do the good work that we might be inclined to do because we think it's good work, but specifically we are called to do the good work that is the means by which we fulfill the call to live in love. If I am to fulfill my calling, my vocation, to the work of senior academic leadership as the president of a small university, then I need to ask precisely this question. What does this imitate God as you live in love mean, and what does it mean for myself as I live with generous service towards others? When we ask, what does it mean to live in love, when it comes to the work that we are called to, the ways in which we are called to engage the world, our spheres of responsibility, specifically those spheres of responsibility where we long for the redemptive work of God to take shape, it is helpful to recognize that we're not the first ones to begin to kind of wrestle with this question. And indeed, throughout the history of the church, the question has been wrestled with and responded to through various permutations, distinct expressions, distinct nuances. And this history can be informative, insightful, providing wisdom for Christians of our generation as we seek to ask the question, what does it mean to live in love? I find it particularly helpful to consider the history of the Christian religious orders and to ask how indeed the founding of each order was an attempt to institutionalize the call to live in love, to give the call institutional identity and thus redemptive impact. The orders, as we know them, have been founded under and are found within under the umbrella of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And without doubt, a consideration of these religious orders needs to take account of the impact of Vatican II, which included a call towards the end of Vatican II by the Council of Bishops to the various religious orders to reconsider, to go back, to reflect on their distinctive callings, to go back and reflect on their original founding, to consider their original charism and discern how that might find expression in the 20th century and beyond. And what this has done is highlight for us today as students of religious orders, is highlight that indeed there are distinctive chapters, distinctive seasons in the histories of these orders, in the history of these orders, and that the founding of new religious orders often represented a distinctive vision of what it means to live in love. Specifically, what it means to respond to the call of God to live in generous, self-giving service. There are many chapters and many nuances in the development of the history of religious orders, but it is not an oversimplification. For those of you present to my talk this morning, I'm not a historian. It is not an oversimplification to observe that there are three distinct movements or evolutions, transitions, and thus nuances, noteworthy informative nuances in the formation of each new religious order, but particularly there are three movements. I find it helpful when it comes to thinking about the religious orders to recognize three distinct expressions: the Benedictine, the Mendicant, and the Apostolic. Each is distinct, though the latter two, without doubt, are an adaptation from the early Benedictine vision. Give me some time and space and consider each of these before I come to, as part of my conclusion, a reflection on what this history might mean for us today. First, the Benedictine monastic vision. By the 5th century, monasticism was an established feature of both Western and Eastern Christianity. Inspired by the life of St. Anthony, written by St. Athanasius, thousands of Christians, young and old, chose to commit themselves to a rigorous asceticism in response to the perceived degeneration of the church and of the Christian community within Roman society, particularly urban society. This might have been a passing fad if it were not for the genius, the organizational genius of Benedict of Nursia. With the demise of the Roman Empire happening all around him, evident in the breakdown of the social order, Benedict fled from Rome to find solitude, imitating the life of Anthony and others who found refuge in the desert. His solitude was frequently interrupted by encounters with others on a similar journey who were drawn to his sanctity. But those who came to him were an unruly lot, lacking discipline, lacking order, and any semblance of genuine Christian transformation. In time, he established an ordered community 100 kilometers south of Rome in a place that probably many of you have visited, Monte Cassino. The foundation of this order, this community, was governed by a rule under the obedience of an abbot in a daily routine of prayer, study, and manual labor. The rule of St. Benedict is a stunning legacy, his magisterial contribution to European civilization. But the pivot on which life in community turned was, of course, the liturgical hours, the daily office. They were first and foremost a worshiping community, with liturgy and worship the means and basis for religious formation and therefore the experience of the transforming grace of God. Yet more, it was an ordered community living quite intentionally in isolation from the city, distant not just geographically, but spiritually. And that distance from the city was essential. It was a vision for the world that was lived out in isolation from the world. In time, this monastery not only flourished, but it established a whole group of sister institutions, also living under the rule of St. Benedict. And for the next 300 years, these monasteries were crucial institutions that sustained a level of civility that was likely only possible in what we often speak of as the Dark Ages. And yet, over the course of the centuries, 300 years, there was a decline in the core commitments of the Benedictine movement. A reform was in order. And in 909 A.D., Count William of Aquitaine founded a monastery in Cluny with the intent that the monastery would follow the Benedictine ideals strictly and do so without undue pressure from either the government or from church authorities. And within a century, Cluny was the spiritual center of the life of Europe. Another decline came in the 12th century, and this led to the establishing of another monastery and another renewal movement, in this case under Bernard, guess where, in Clairvaux, perhaps indeed the greatest and most influential person of his century. And then another renewal movement came in the 17th century in the monastery of La Trappe in France, noteworthy in part because the most famous monk, least famous on this continent, is surely the Trappist, St. Thomas Merton, 20th century spiritual writer, occasional hermit of the monastery of Gethsemane near Louisville, Kentucky. And no one in my mind captures this Benedictine vision more powerfully than he, the vision of the contemplative, brilliantly articulated in his New Seeds of Contemplation. His was a deep and profound love for the world and a concern for the world, but it was lived out of a hermitage in isolation from the world. And I say all this to say that this is a religious expression, probably very different from yours and mine, yet nevertheless, it is still a very vital religious expression. I visit monasteries in this tradition often, including Gethsemane, but my favorite is Christ in the Desert. I was there again last year, this time, found in an isolated corner of New Mexico, way off the major highway, deep into the desert. A spectacular location, and you run into monks there who are fulfilling their vocation to be indeed agents of God's grace in the world and in the city by locating themselves as far as they possibly can from the city. Secondly, one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the church comes in the 13th century, largely because society was becoming more and more urban. It would not be until the 20th century, if not the 21st, before the majority of humanity live in cities. But by the 13th century, cities were the centers of influence, political, economic, cultural, and of course, intellectual. On the intellectual front, by the end of the 12th century, there were major universities in Bologna, Oxford, and Paris. In this dramatic transition, this liminal time, two crucial orders, religious orders, were established. Up until this point, the highest expression of the spiritual life was assumed to be in retreat, in contemplation, far from the city. But then two religious figures emerged on the scene with a rather different view of what it meant to fulfill the Christian ideal to love. Domingo of Spain, whom we know as Saint Dominic, and Saint Francis of Italy, after whom the current pope is named. Francis was born in 1182, just before the beginning of the 13th century, and as he emerged into adulthood, he was taken with the call of Christ to the way of poverty. Sell everything you have and give it to the poor. He renounced all of his possessions, choosing to live in communion with God and with nature, but with a deep commitment to Christ as the defining center of his vision of the Christian life. But the two go together for Francis. One would only live in the love of Christ, and thus be a means of God's expression of love for others if one renounced one's possessions, all to that end, to identify with the poor. It is noteworthy, it seems to me, that as I said, the current pontiff of Rome, Pope Francis, has chosen his name. The current pope is a Jesuit, but in so many of his sensibilities, he reflects the Franciscan charism. Dominic was born earlier, 1170. He chose the religious life and became a prior under the Bishop of Diego in the Burgo of Osma in Spain. He too felt called to the way of poverty, but something else drove him, namely a concern for truth and the proclamation of the truth. And Dominic is for many the preacher's saint. Indeed, the last time that I served as a full-time pastor, I had a little statuette of St. Dominic in my corner reminding me to the importance of quality scholarship in forming good preaching. He eventually established an order with a high commitment to scholarship on the one hand, the sciences and scripture, and preaching on the other. Also, in contrast to the Franciscans, Dominic established an order of priests, and this was with the commitment to establishing universities ruled by and taught by these priests, essentially the first universities of the Western world. I think, for example, of the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, Philippines, as but one example of this expression of their charism, but it was always a commitment to scholarship in support of teaching and preaching. G.K. Chesterton has observed that these two 13th century giants, that in them we have a wonderful counterpoint of word and deed, that, as Chesterton observes, is central to the mission of God and thus to the mission of the church. But what I would most like to profile about these two new religious orders is the following: that they chose to live not in isolation from the city, but right in the midst of the cities to which they were called. There's actually a third religious order that was also established in that century, the Augustinians, named after the Bishop of Hippo, who followed the rule of life that he had originally articulated centuries before. And what is noteworthy is how all three, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Augustinians, established houses not far from the heart or the center of the city. And you see this most notably in the New World. I grew up in Ecuador in South America, and Quito, the magnificent capital high in the Andes, has an exquisite Plaza Mayor, the central plaza at the heart of the city. 4 sides to the plaza: the seat of government, the cathedral, opposite the cathedral, the bishop's palace, and then, of course, a major commercial center on the other, 4th side. And then all within a few blocks from the very heart of the city, you have the Franciscans just up the hill, the Dominicans a little further away the other direction, and the Augustinians just down the street from the central plaza. These are huge complexes, especially the Dominicans and the Franciscans, but more to the point, they are in the city. Both Francis and Dominic were men of prayer. They were not discounting the place of contemplation by going to the city. Rather, they sought prayer and contemplation not away from the city, but in the very heart of the city. They left the monastery enclosure so that they could be present to the city, so that the benefits of their contemplation could impact the city more directly. Or, as it is put in the words of the greatest Dominican theologian of all, St. Thomas Aquinas, we go into the world and into the city, his words, to share the fruit of contemplation. For both Francis and Dominic, their involvement with the city could only be sustained if they and their followers were first individuals of prayer and contemplation. Thirdly, from the 13th century, we move to the 16th and to the next major development in the evolution of religious orders. And it's a radical, dramatic development: the establishing of the first truly apostolic order, the Society of Jesus, more typically known of as the Jesuits. Ignatius Loyola, as with St. Dominic, also from Spain, had a profound mystical experience in Manresa. Eventually, he goes to Paris to study, and there he formed a small band of companions, including Francis Xavier, St. Francis Xavier, who also chose the way of poverty, and in time persuaded the Pope to authorize the formation of a very different, new religious order, the Companions or Society of Jesus. They would have as their charism or orientation the apostolate. It was at heart a missionary order. He did not establish monastic houses. Ignatius was deeply committed to prayer. Indeed, for many of us, perhaps many of us in this room, his spiritual exercises are an indispensable guide to mental prayer. But the order he established did not prioritize prayer over action, prayer over service. Previously, it was assumed that the most sacred thing you could do was to pray, and then you went into the world to kind of make the best of it. This finds expression in an ironic kind of a way within my own evangelical tradition, because oftentimes we are inclined to say that if we have to choose between work and prayer, well, you're best to go with the prayer. The odds are you're going to be doing better activity. And it's really quite easy to say we should work less and pray more. And there's a certain tone of voice with which you're supposed to do that. But you would never want to say we should pray a little less and do more work. Then you would get in serious trouble. Then also, my tradition tends to assume that if we're going to go on prayer retreats, there are kind of a filling up the gas tank kind of experience, with the assumption that the retreat center is a holy place and that the world is a secular place, along the lines of the vision actually of the mendicant orders. But the Ignatian tradition suggests otherwise. It's very distinctly not a monastic order. Ignatius was convinced that while we certainly can and must meet God in prayer, God is going ahead of us into the world. God is not just in our prayer closet and in our churches and in our retreat centers. God is present in all things, and thus in moving into the world, we are not moving away from the sphere of God into a secular zone, but rather we can, and this is the crucial line, we can find and see God in all things. And that union with God is found in both in prayer and loving engagement with God in the world. Therefore, in the Ignatian vision, we do not prioritize prayer over action, prayer over engagement, prayer over service. We are prayers. This is essential to our capacity to be in, but not of the world, but we are called to be in the world. And thus, in a sense, echoing this in the writings now of Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his magisterial classic, Life Together, he talks about the need to come to our prayers as those who have been in the world, and then to go into the world as those who are prayers. And we don't compromise either one. That is, we do neither at the expense of the other. Each, prayer and service, prayer and work, have integrity in their own right. And thus, prayer is not merely about being connected with God so we can become more effective in the world. Rather this, that for Ignatius, prayer and action inform and animate each other. We pray as those who are in the world. We are in the world as those who pray. The apostolic vision, then, this apostolic vision, is not limited to the Jesuits, of course. There's within town here, there's a wonderful retreat center just behind the Roman Catholic Cathedral that is supervised and owned by the faithful companions of Jesus. And they have embraced the Ignatian vision as well, so they see themselves as heirs to that. But they make the observation that the Jesuits are the companions of Jesus. We are the faithful companions of Jesus. I love their wit. And they'll tell you that you're going to be there 10 minutes, and you're going to find out that they are the faithful companions of Jesus. If you want to ask anything about their charism, they'll compare themselves to those other Ignatian people. We are the faithful ones, they are wanting to tell you. And of late, I have really come to appreciate ever more deeply the vision and ministry of the Paulist Fathers, which is the first religious order to be established here in North America. It is based in their mother house in New York City, 49th Street and 9th Avenue, right in the very heart of the city, but not in a monastic house. They are called to service in the world, and they have a very vibrant, and of course this interests me, you can understand why, a very vibrant student ministry on the campuses across this country, and a very deep and vibrant commitment to ecumenism. But now, in response to that history lesson from a theologian. First, back to Ephesians chapter 5. The first point of departure in this conversation needs to be the baseline, the call to live in love. This means that the fundamental human calling, the essential vocation of the church and of the individual Christian is to love in generous, self-giving service. What does it mean to love? Well, it means more than this. But the text of Ephesians chapter 5 reminds us that to love, to give ourselves in service, surely means to meet the need of the other. To love is to respond to the genuine need of our neighbor. I need to ask for myself, at this stage of my life, my work, my ministry, my calling, what do those that I am called to love, what is needed from me? What does my wife need from me? It's not complicated. To love her is to ask, what does she need from me? My sons, to ask, at this stage of their life, in their mid-30s, what do they need from me? What does my mother, a widow, what does she need from me? What need of hers can I fulfill? And it means at the university where I serve that I do not ask, what kind of president do I want to be, but I ask, what kind of president is needed by this institution for such a time as this? And the key point here is that family situations and institutions and communities and countries such as our own evolve. New circumstances emerge, new challenges and new opportunities. So there's a constant process of discernment, asking the question, what is needed from me at this point? But then quickly, we also need to add the observation, the call actually, from Simone Weil, who in her reflections on the call to generous service insists that service truly offered is uncalculated. She speaks in her classic, Waiting for God, of how service is like eating. From one day to the next, we forget yesterday's meal because we are hungry again and we need to eat today. She suggests that one of the indications of true service is that it does not lead to a spirit of entitlement. We do not collect IOUs. We do not have a stamp book. We are not signaling in so many words, "You owe me one." Rather, we serve with an uncalculated generosity. We serve with generosity. We do what needs to be done, not because it will bring us thanks or recognition or reward, but simply because it needs doing. And as a sidebar there, what it means is that some of the most significant work we do in isolation and in obscurity, known to no one other than the person to whom we are most responsible, namely our Lord and our God. And then also, it seems to me that when we look at a phrase such as that of Ephesians chapter 5, we need also stress that responding to need does not mean that we do not know how to say no. Somewhere in the writings of Parker Palmer, Palmer makes the observation, God loves you, but I am not necessarily the means by which you're going to know the love of God. In other words, our love has to be grounded in two things. One, a deep knowledge that we are loved. We do not need to kind of pursue the love of others. And secondly, we need to have clarity about the particular ways in which we are being called to love. We need to have what you might call a discerning love, discerning how I am being called to be an instrument of God's love. A discerning love requires attention to the counterpoint between our love for God, which finds primary expression in our prayers, and our love for others, for the world, that finds primary expression in our service. And here's where I think the history of the religious orders might be pertinent, instructive, helpful. My question, could it be that each of these models or charisms, each of these distinctive approaches might have contemporary relevance? That each is an expression of what it means to live in love for the world? If so, it will mean that there are those whom we know, not likely among us this evening, but possibly a few, those for whom the Benedictine charism and vision animates their lives, their vocations. I say they're not likely here because they're not inclined to stay in these kinds of hotels, and they're not inclined to attend these kinds of conferences. Bless their hearts. I think of the women and men for whom our society, with its deep pragmatism, its deep noisiness, its deep distraction, its deep anxiety, weighs heavy on their minds, and for whom their quiet routines and work rhythms in convents, in gardens, often at the margins of our cities, indeed often far from our cities, that maybe these are vital, these people in these vocations are vital to the purposes of God in the world and to our vocations, the work of those of us who live more fully engaged with the world. They will live in gardens, in convents, monasteries, in quiet. I think, for example, in the city, better put, at the margins of the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and by the way, just as an aside, you'll find the same thing in the city of Buenos Aires. The Dominicans, the Franciscans, and the Augustinians are all within a few blocks of the Plaza Mayor, of the main central plaza, not far from the cathedral there in Buenos Aires, so the same thing that I mentioned about Quito. But there on the margin of the city, at the edge of the city, I was privileged to speak at a gathering in retreat of theological educators from the Southern Cone. My son came along with me. We went to Paraguay to visit some theological schools there. Then we went to Iguazu Falls, and then we went to this convent that was also a retreat center. Andrew joined us for breakfast in the morning. He was back in the evening for dinner, but during the day he was out to explore the city of Buenos Aires. I was there 5 days. Andrew joined me for 3 days. And he made a connection with these nuns that were managing this retreat center. They liked him. He liked them. I liked them as well. And after 3 days, I needed to take him to the airport. We grabbed a taxi. I went with him to the airport, wished him well as he returned back to Canada. When I came back to the convent retreat center, the Sister Superior, a Filipina woman. She greeted me at the door, asked how my son had gone, and she said this. She said, "You need to know that I and the sisters will be praying for your son." I said, again, what do you mean? What I mean is, then she pointed back to the sisters, and you could see them through the door. She says, "We've talked about it. We're going to pray for your son." I'm good with that. I have learned, I'm reminded, I have learned to lean on and depend on the prayers of those who have a contemplative, anchoring presence, the prayers of those who live far from the madness of the city, where the focus and context of my work necessarily takes me. My work that takes me through the cities, through the airports, through security lineups, through immigration, through customs, and I go on and on and on, and it's like many of you. But in the process, I've learned to depend on the prayers of women like those in the convent just outside the city of Buenos Aires. And if you're thinking to yourself, I need to know about that convent because of my daughter, get your own convent and sisters. They're mine. Actually, I had a phone call this afternoon in which I think I need to make a return visit to give them an update on my other son, whom they need to meet. 2 days later, when I left the convent and returned to the airport, I asked them the question. You can understand why I asked them. I said, "How do you discern what you are to pray for?" And she just laughed. She says, "We just wait and see who God brings to our door." Wow. Then also the mendicant vision. To choose the way of prayer. Part of the reason why I highlighted the first is if that's you, get over the guilt. Get past the guilt of our deeply activistic religious subcultures that have no understanding of the vocation and calling that God has given to you. Then also the mendicant vision, to choose the way of prayer-animated immersion in the world with particular attention to either the poor or the world of scholarship and teaching. And in our day, there's an emerging movement, typically spoken of as the new monasticism, that is bringing together individuals and families living in community or at least in close connection. They say the daily office, so that the rhythms of daily prayer together are allowed to inform the life and work to which they are called. But also there are those who we can celebrate and affirm for whom their call takes them to the underside of our city and to the underside of our world. Whether it's Doctors Without Borders, or whether it's the Calgary Crisis Pregnancy Center here in this city, or those for whom the bulk of their time or for a season, of their time, they are immersed in a zone of deep need. I think here also of the dental clinic I was privileged to visit a couple of years ago in Costa Rica that serves Nicaraguan refugees and the North American dentists who volunteer to staff these clinics in 2-week stints. But let me stress something here. The genius of the mendicant vision was that it was anchored in and animated by contemplation, by prayer. We can so easily get lost within the pain of the world, making us vulnerable, at least me, but I suspect most of us, to cynicism, if we do not sustain a healthy practice of disengagement, better put, prayerful disengagement. I think back to the work that I was so deeply moved by, this tremendous group of young people from New Zealand who were living amongst the squatter settlements of Metro Manila when I lived there. Huge dedication, remarkable commitment to live among the poor and to be God's grace among the poor, and yet they lacked basic routines of Sabbath disengagement of prayer, ideally daily prayer, that would make such an immersion sustainable. Again, the genius of St. Francis and St. Dominic was the daily office, the contemplative routines that animated and sustained their daily work. But where I would like to conclude this evening is with the third model, or charism. I wonder if, for most of us, the apostolic vision for a discerning engagement in the world might be most relevant and immediate. However much we, you and I, might value and affirm both the Benedictine and the mendicant movements or models and their relevance for our day, most of us in this room are likely called to the work, the daily work, that is of a different character. And for this, I wonder if we might not consider the wisdom that emerges from the apostolic and Ignatian traditions. The heart of the matter, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is that we would let our prayers and our work inform each other. We go into the world as prayers, and our prayers sustain our capacity for, at the very least, three things. Number one, they anchor us in the generosity of God. They fuel a generous, uncalculated service because our deepest ego needs are not met by our work, but by lives that dwell in the love of God. That is, that in our prayers, and I use the word contemplation intentionally, we meet Christ in real time, and Christ in real time grants us the deep assurance that we are loved. Secondly, we are able in our prayers, and because of our prayers, to sustain a capacity to say no without an oppressive guilt. That was classic evangelical, meaning just moderate levels of guilt. Without any guilt, delete that from the notes. We are not asked to be heroes, messiahs, but merely to be able to do what we are called to do in this day. And our prayers give us both perspective and peace to do what we are called to do and to live in gracious acceptance of what we cannot do. They keep us from bucking against the limits of time to graciously accept, as Father Thomas Ryan, a Paulist father, puts it, we learn to live with the limits of time, the poverty of time, and thus the limits of our own humanity. We develop the capacity to discern, to know what we are called to do, but also to graciously accept what we are not called or do not need to do. And further, our prayers sustain our hope so that we can be thoroughly in the world, but with the deep confidence that evil does not have the last word. This may not be as live an issue for you as for me, for some as for others, but for myself, this is so crucial. I can so easily be overwhelmed by the obstacles, the setbacks, the impossibility of it all. And what my community needs is a person who, by his prayers, knows the grace of a resilient hope that is granted to him in his prayers. I say to those of you that are liturgists and worship leaders, not everybody in this room needs this, but most of us need this on Sunday morning. What we need is to be reminded of the love of God, to be reminded that we do not need to live guilty for what we cannot do, and to have a resilient hope that enables us to do what we are called to do with consistency and with perseverance. But more, and just as crucial and just as critical, the genius of the apostolic vision, the Ignatian vision, is that while our prayers inform our work, the reverse is also the case, that our work informs our prayers. We pray as those who are in the world. I am part of a religious subculture that has, over the last generation, moved slowly but surely towards a liturgy in our weekend worship that can, unfortunately, be described as escapist. You can go to the churches where I preach Sunday after Sunday, including last Sunday, where all we do is sing happy songs, happy, clappy songs, that have no sense that the world outside is in crisis. Last Sunday, where I preached, you would have no sense that our nation is wrestling with matters of truth and reconciliation and the residential schools of the Aboriginal people. You would have no knowledge that a police officer was brought down in our own province earlier last week. You would have no sense that the people who are here on this particular day have any troubles at all, because all we are singing is happy songs. There's a profound disconnect, you might say, between our lives in the world, our personal lives and challenges, and that which is profiled in the newspaper and our worship. The assumption seems to be that if we do this kind of escapist worship, we will feel good, and if we feel good, we might be better Christians. But what is missed, tragically, is the sense that we come to worship as those who are very much in the world, who see and feel the full force of its fragmentation. And the Ignatian Examen is a tool, a vehicle, for allowing, indeed insisting, that what we experience in the world is part of the purposes of God, that the joys and sorrows we experience in the world are something that we necessarily bring into our prayers and thus into our worship. And that thus our worship is only authentic, only true worship, only transformative worship, only worship that truly empowers us to live in love, if it is a safe place to be able to bring the pains and sorrows of this world, yea, right into the heart of our worship. There is a hymn that oftentimes I struggle to quote. It has a line in it that when this hymn is sung, and unfortunately it is sung all too rarely, the hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul," that has the line that I can see the line coming, and I just know, do I steel myself for this line, or do I just let it hit me? It is the line, and if you know the hymn, you know where I'm going. When sorrows like sea billows roll. Ooh. The punch, the power of the hymn is that it brings the sorrows of this world not out there where they're not even relevant, but now suddenly they're coming into our worship like sorrows, like billows that roll again and again and again. And some of you know what the psalm writer, the hymn writer, is talking about. You've experienced sorrow that just seems to come in waves after wave after wave. And if you haven't, there is somebody there on Sunday morning for whom it is their experience even now. And what I grieve is that nothing in contemporary hymnody or songwriting can match it. But what bothers me is not so much that there aren't contemporary songs that match it, but that contemporary songwriters aren't even trying to match it. That is, they don't know how to sing about the pain, suffering, and fragmentation of our world, and therefore how to bring it into the worship. The genius, of course, of true prayer, as is captured brilliantly by the psalmists. The Psalter, of course, does this again and again and again. Both the prayers of the church and the prayers of the individual Christian, the genius of transformative prayer, true prayer, is that we pray with a deep attentiveness, a deep awareness of the emotional traces that the world we live and work in leaves upon our lives, the joys and sorrows of our work, of our families, of our church, our communities, our cities, and our country, and indeed our world. And the process means that we grow, actually, in faith, hope, and, of course, love. We grow in our capacity to love well, to love with discernment. Dear people, fellow learners, pilgrims on the way, we need women and men who are faithful in their calling, but more. We need those who live with a simple yet daily resolve to live in love. But even more than that, we need together to foster a capacity for discerning love that is informed by the counterpoint between our work and our worship, between our vocation and our prayers. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. Smith.